There are rooms no one was ever meant to enter, but sometimes the walls remember, the floors creak with withheld breath. And in a town like Belle Hive, Tennessee, sometimes even the basement cries out. The town of Belle Hive was founded on Appalachian salt and timber. By 1849, it was quiet, tight-knit, religious, and just suspicious enough of outsiders to protect its own secrets. It lay nestled in a low valley, flanked by sycamores and fog, with homes perched on wide verandas and streets still paved in crushed gravel and gilt. I first came across the Holloway nursery case when reviewing forgotten coroner logs digitized by the Tennessee State Archives. A single line caught my eye: infant remains recovered in Holloway property. Decomposition inconsistent with timeline. Dolls confiscated. I cross-checked it with census records, church logs, and letters preserved in family estates. No mention of any deaths at the Holloway household that year. No mention of children either. Yet neighbors swore the Holloways had as many as 6 children, maybe more, and that they kept them in line like God intended. Belle Hive doesn't speak of the Holloways anymore. Not really. Their home stood at the corner of Briar Hollow and Elm Fork Road. It's gone now. Burned down in 1892 in what the papers called divine intervention by flame. But I found sketches, floor plans, and records from when the Holloway estate was first appraised during the investigation. And there was a room, a basement chamber, sealed with a heavy door reinforced with scrap iron. Inside, painted walls, a rotted crib, and shelves upon shelves of dolls, some handmade, others store-bought from catalogues, each of them dressed in mourning black, each missing their eyes. But it wasn't until I visited Belle Hive myself that I began to understand just how deep the story went. The town square of Belle Hive still smells like cinnamon, tobacco, and creek water. There's a Baptist church that rings on the hour, and a general store that still sells rock candy and penny nails, a place forgotten by time, or maybe protected by it. I met with Eleanor Ridgewood, the oldest living resident, now 93, who lives just 2 blocks from where the Holloway home once stood. "That house was always too quiet," she said, staring at her tea. "No laughter, no cries, just silence. Children should never be that quiet." She was only 17 when the discovery was made, but her memory of that autumn is sharp. The night before they raided it, dogs howled for hours, and not just a few, all of them. The sky was blood orange, and something clanged from beneath the ground, like chains or metal scraping stone. I found similar accounts in letters written to the sheriff at the time. One note, unsigned, read, "There are children down there, I know it. I heard them again last night. Something's not right. The Holloways are keeping more than secrets in that basement." But no action was taken, not until a farmhand named Josiah Penley, hired to help dig a new well on the edge of the Holloway property, discovered a soft patch of earth that gave way beneath his shovel. What he found wasn't water. It was a burial pit, lined with charcoal-dusted dolls, beneath them bones, tiny ones. The Holloways were a model couple. That's how the newspaper described them. Reverend Holloway was a devout man, soft-spoken, sharply dressed, with a silver watch he'd wind every hour as a prayer. His wife, Cordelia, ran the local sewing circle and was known for her delicate needlework and herbal remedies. They attended church every Sunday, donated more than anyone else in town, and yet no one could remember seeing their children outside after dusk. No one ever saw them at school. In fact, no teacher in Belle Hive could confirm they'd been enrolled. They were always spoken of, but never spoken to, Eleanor told me. Like ghosts, you weren't supposed to notice. I visited the original property, now overtaken by vines and crowned with a historical marker so worn the words have faded to near ashes. But I found something there, wedged beneath a stone threshold from the old root cellar, a small shoe, leather, rotted, the name Etta stitched in fading thread. I took it to the Tennessee Museum of the Unexplained. They confirmed it belonged to a child no older than 4. The wear on the heel indicated she walked in circles, excessively, dragging her right foot. Possibly restrained, the curator noted, or nervous habit under duress. I've seen a lot in my work. Ritual crimes, historic cover-ups, lost testimonies. But this case unnerved me in ways I couldn't name. because the Holloways weren't murderers in the traditional sense. They were caretakers, loving even by Bellhive standards. But what was happening in that basement had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with devotion, twisted, cold, and absolute. The toys were still there when the authorities entered the room, hundreds of them, each labeled, each untouched, each made from wood, straw, and what forensic tests would later reveal included fragments of human hair. They were meant to be seen, but never played with, because in the Holloway house, toys weren't gifts, they were warnings. The devil doesn't walk with horns and smoke. Sometimes he wears polished boots and sings hymns louder than the rest. In 1849, Reverend Elias Holloway was considered the moral compass of Bellhive. Tall and gaunt, with a voice like coal smoothed in silk, he delivered sermons that struck bone, not fire and brimstone, but whispering conviction, soft words that made men confess and women shudder without knowing why. He and his wife Cordelia were the kind of people others tried to imitate. They hosted garden socials, church picnics, and holiday blessings on their sprawling 2-acre property. Cordelia, always in muted pastels, was known for her lavender cakes and kindness to orphans. People spoke of her as an angel walking, which made it all the more convenient to look away when things didn't add up. Elias had come from eastern Kentucky, ordained under the Old Holiness branch, a stricter sect known for cleansing rituals and extreme fasting. He rarely spoke of his childhood, but once, in an 1845 sermon, he mentioned witnessing his sister's purification. The church records described it as a moment of spiritual release. Whatever that meant was lost to time. Cordelia was raised in Bellhive, the daughter of a seamstress and a cattleman. Her journals, yes, I obtained some pages from a distant niece, are sparse but telling. One entry stands out: "I cannot sleep for the crying. The walls have no mercy. I have asked Elias if the Lord will forgive a weak mother." February 12, 1847, most people in town believed the Holloways had 6 children: Abraham, Ruth, Liddy, Samuel, Etta, and the youngest, called only Baby Joe by neighbors. But no one could confirm those names on any census. In fact, every year they were conspicuously left blank or marked private religious household, which Reverend Holloway had permission for due to a rarely enforced exemption under Tennessee's Spiritual Privacy Ordinance. He argued the children were being educated at home through scripture. No one questioned it. The Holloway home was immaculate on the outside. White-painted clapboard siding, black shutters, and a wrought-iron gate carved with vine motifs. There was a parlor with a grand piano no one ever heard played. Upstairs, 3 bedrooms, all modest and pristine. No sign of children's belongings. But the basement, that's where the nursery was found. It wasn't on the original house plans. It was carved into the limestone bedrock, reinforced with timber. The door, heavy as a coffin lid, was triple locked. No key was ever found. Authorities had to break it open with a pickaxe. Inside was a chamber precisely 8 feet wide and 8 feet tall. The walls had been painted pale blue, though most of the color had peeled into flakes. Hand-drawn animals in chalk circled the room: lambs, doves, frogs, and between them phrases written in childlike scrawl: "Do not touch the toys. Be good, or the root comes. The watcher loves quiet." These phrases would later be traced to Elias's own sermons, particularly one he gave in July of 1848 titled "The Root of Sin." There was a single crib in the room. It was burnt at the base, as if someone had tried to destroy it and stopped halfway. A rocking chair faced the wall, positioned as if someone had spent hours rocking in silence while watching the paint peel. Cordelia's friends remembered her speaking fondly of her little lambs, but never naming them directly. Her letters to the sewing circle are riddled with religious metaphors and cryptic euphemisms. The lambs have been difficult. One tried to rise before cleansing. Elias says I must not waver. The Lord watches through the grain. Letter to Priscilla Gibbons, November 1846. Even more unsettling, there were no birth certificates for any of the Holloway children, no baptismal records, no recorded deaths. And yet, Townspeople had seen the children, or at least glimpsed them. Amelia Doss, who lived across the hollow, wrote in a diary which I was able to view at the Bellhive Historical Society, "One stood in the window again, hair like straw, eyes black with sun behind them. When I waved, it ducked, always ducking, always watching." A pattern began to emerge. Those who visited the Holloway home, briefly and under supervision, spoke of a strange hush, like the house was holding its breath. No laughter, no tantrums, just footsteps. Slow, careful footsteps and a faint thump, like toys being moved when no one was looking. There was one neighbor who remembered more. Miles Cartwright, whose great-grandfather was 12 years old in 1849, passed down a family story. I interviewed Miles in his workshop behind the old grist mill. "My granddaddy said he played once with one of the Holloway kids, a girl named Etta. They met near the creek. She gave him a doll and said, 'Keep it hidden or he'll take your voice.'" He chuckled nervously. "The weird part, that doll's still in our attic. Every time someone touches it, we get sick. My wife won't let it in the house." I asked to see it. He refused. The picture being painted was clear, but impossible. A devout couple, a respected home, children unseen but often mentioned, a basement that shouldn't exist, and toys no one dared touch. But why? Why build a nursery in secret? Why teach children to fear silence, dolls, and the root? And how did no one notice, not truly, until it was far, far too late? That answer would begin with whispers, and one small warning sign almost everyone ignored. We always tell ourselves we'd notice, that we'd speak up. But the truth is, horror rarely arrives screaming. It trickles in, a squeak in the floorboards, a glance too long, and toys left in places they shouldn't be. Agreed, the first warning sign wasn't a scream. It wasn't even a sound. It was absence. The Holloways, as prominent as they were in Bellhive, began to shift their patterns quietly after the winter of 1846. Cordelia stopped attending the sewing circle. Elias preached less fire and more mercy. Neighbors noticed the family no longer allowed visitors indoors, only on the porch, and never after dusk. Around that time, rumors began to circulate, small ones. Whispers caught between clotheslines and communion. A neighbor, Miriam Clark, wrote in a letter to her sister, "Something isn't right at the Holloway place. Their windows are blacked with heavy drapes now. And last night I saw Elias out back burning something. It smelled sweet and wrong, like cloth and oil. I think it was a doll." March 1847, I tracked down the Clark family farm and walked the stretch where Miriam said she'd seen the burning. The ground is long since turned, but even now, something lingers. Not a smell, but a weight, as if the air itself holds memory. From 1847 onward, townsfolk began to comment on the strange behavior of the Holloway children, when they were seen at all. One merchant, Samuel Everett, noted a girl, possibly Liddy, who came to purchase soap, with hands bandaged so tightly her fingers were blue. I asked what happened. She didn't speak, just stared at the floor. Cordelia stepped in before I could press. She said it was a lesson in obedience. Store ledger note, July 2nd, 1847. That phrase, "a lesson in obedience," shows up repeatedly in the surviving church documents written by Elias. Sermons, private notes, even the margin of his Bible. But perhaps the most telling warning came from a girl named Temperance Reed, age 11 at the time, whose diary survived nearly intact in a family attic. She had drawn a map of her street, and in the corner a crude sketch of the Holloway home, marked with a symbol, 3 X's inside a square. Next to it she wrote, "We heard it again, the knock under the ground. Mama says it's moles. I think it's Etta." Diary entry, August 1848. At first, I assumed the knocking was metaphor. But when I found a set of stone foundation plans filed with the Bellhive archives, I noticed something odd. A vent system that ran beneath the Holloway home, supposedly for coal heating. Yet no records ever show a furnace installed. So what were the vents for? And why were they sealed with wax plugs? A man named Hiram Jessup had once been hired to deliver lumber to the Holloway estate. He never went inside, but what he saw from the yard stayed with him. I found his account in an 1871 interview with the Chattanooga Ledger. There were voices, small ones, chanting maybe. I swear I heard them coming up from the cellar doors. Then quiet, like someone told them to hush all at once, like they'd been listening to me. The children's voices were never heard playing, only chanting, only whispering. The toys were another early warning. Children in Bellhive traded rag dolls, wooden horses, and marbles. But none of the Holloway children ever swapped toys. In fact, according to accounts from the local school teacher who once attempted to host a holiday exchange, they refused to even touch others' toys. Abraham Holloway slapped a whittled top from a boy's hand, screamed, "It isn't clean," and ran. His hand started bleeding right after, like he'd been burned just holding it. School Ledger, December 1848. And then there were the carvings. Strange symbols began to appear near the Holloway property, scratched into trees, etched into fence posts, even burned into the bark with what looked like lye or acid. Simple patterns, interlocking rings, hands with stitched mouths, and crude nursery symbols like rattle shapes or cradle motifs, with thorns added. One traveler described passing by the Holloway house on horseback and hearing a lullaby sung in reverse. It made his horse buck so violently he broke 2 ribs. He never returned to Bellhive. The final warning came weeks before the raid. A man named Caleb Horn, a hired well digger, had approached the town council to report something he unearthed near the Holloway root cellar. Not bones, at least not at first. He found a box, buried 6 feet down, small, about the size of a lunch pail. Inside, 2 dolls, perfectly preserved, one made of cloth, the other bone. Both had mouths sewn shut, and between them a note scrawled in a child's hand. "We were not quiet enough, they heard us cry." Caleb brought the box to the sheriff, who told him to stop stirring old dirt. The sheriff, it turned out, was a regular guest at the Holloway's garden suppers. The box was never seen again. But Caleb, he disappeared 1 week later. No body, no note, just a patch of disturbed earth behind his workshop, and the handle of a toy horse sticking out of the dirt like a grave marker. The town had its warnings. They had their strange nights, their unspoken questions, and children who wouldn't speak of what they saw. But nothing was done. Not until the cries returned, not until the blood rose in the water, and not until someone finally said the words out loud, "There's something wrong with the Holloway's nursery." Isolation isn't always about distance. Sometimes it's a silence that spreads like rot, a closing of shutters, a shrinking of the circle, a quiet, deliberate unmaking of the world outside, until only one voice remains. By the fall of 1848, the Holloway family had become an island within Bellhive. Where once Cordelia had shared recipes and Elias had baptized neighbors in the river, now the family had turned inward, shielded behind blackout curtains, iron gates, and scripture that grew darker with each sermon. The children, those few glimpses the townsfolk still caught, appeared thinner. Their clothes, once neatly tailored, now hung loose at the shoulders, their eyes sunken, movements stiff, controlled, too controlled. "They didn't walk like children," said Miriam Clark in a letter to her cousin. "They marched, like something terrible was just out of sight behind them." It was more than odd behavior now. It was fear. Parents began whispering about how their own children refused to walk past the Holloway property. One girl, aged 6, reportedly had night terrors about a man with string fingers who whistled through the ground. She had never met Elias Holloway. More than whispers began to take hold. Elias told the church board he'd withdrawn the children from all town activities to preserve their spiritual purity. He called the outside world a harbinger of filth and noise. Few pushed back. He still tithed generously, still buried the dead for free, but the change was unmistakable. The Holloways stopped attending Sunday meals. Cordelia stopped answering letters. When the town physician, Dr. Samuel Ward, asked to perform a wellness visit, citing a community health initiative, he was met at the gate by Elias with a shotgun. "God watches this house," Elias said, his voice unnervingly calm. "We need no eyes but his." From that moment forward, no one else tried to intervene. and then the sounds began. At first, it was just scratching, soft and rhythmic, like a rake dragged along the inside of a stone wall. Then thumps, small but sharp, as if something or someone was knocking from within. Those who lived closest reported hearing lullabies at night, not sung but hummed, always off-key, always slow, always ending with the same breathy line, "Don't wake the watcher." The term watcher appears again and again in the Holloway records, especially in Elias's sermon notes. In one transcript from late 1848 he wrote, "The watcher sees beyond pain. He listens through walls. He punishes the disobedient with silence." It wasn't a metaphor, not anymore. I believe Elias meant it literally. By now, even Cordelia seemed changed. Her hair, once pinned in pristine coils, now hung loose and unwashed. She was seen at dusk, gathering blackberries from the edge of the woodline, muttering to herself in fragments of nursery rhymes. Her hands bled from the thorns. She did not flinch. Some say she was speaking to someone not visible. Others say she was answering something only she could hear. Social isolation turned into spiritual siege. The Holloways stopped taking mail. Visitors were turned away. Church attendance ceased entirely. The only sign of life came from flickering oil lamps seen late into the night, always glowing from the basement window, never any other. And the dolls. They began to appear outside the house, placed on fence posts, hung by thread from trees, left on neighbors' doorsteps in the dead of night, eyes gouged or sewn shut, limbs bound. "We burned the one left on our porch," said Thomas Ridley, whose grandfather lived down the road. "But the next morning it was back. Same doll, not burnt, but this time it had our family name stitched across its chest." The town was unnerved, but Bell Hive didn't believe in confronting darkness head-on. They whispered, they prayed, and they pretended not to see what was right before them. It's easy to ignore horror when it stays behind someone else's walls. Then came the Harvest Fair, October 1848. Every year, the town children participated in a costume parade. That year, none of the Holloway children were expected to attend, but they did. 5 of them arrived, silent, barefoot, dressed in identical black burlap smocks. They stood at the edge of the square, holding hands, watching. They did not speak, did not blink, until one small boy offered a piece of candy to the youngest, a girl, no older than 4. She took it, stared at it, then dropped it to the ground. Cordelia appeared behind her like a shadow and yanked the girl away. Witnesses said she whispered something in the girl's ear. That night, neighbors reported hearing what sounded like a child being whipped. The next morning, fresh scratches were found along the outer vent of the Holloway basement, small fingernail marks in the stone. The parade photo, which I acquired from the Bell Hive archives, is blurry but harrowing. The children do not smile. They do not look at the camera. They look to the side, every single one of them, as if something stood just out of frame, waiting. Cordelia wrote fewer and fewer letters, but one final page survives in the estate of her cousin Martha, sent without postage or return address. It was dated November 3rd, 1848. It reads, "The toys are watching again. I told Elias they shouldn't be left in the open, but he says it keeps them obedient. I hear them crying when he's asleep. He doesn't believe me. He says crying is a sin, but they are so small. They are so small." The Holloways had succeeded. They had isolated themselves entirely, cut off from the world, wrapped in religion, fear, and ritual. The children could no longer leave, and no one else dared try. But that silence was fragile. And the next act in this haunting tale would begin, not with a bang, but with a fall. Every sealed room has a pressure point. Every hidden horror leaves a seam. And on a cold morning in December 1848, one little girl found the edge and tried to slip through it. Her name was Etta, likely the 5th of the Holloway children. She was around 6 years old when she fell, or rather, was found, at the edge of Crowsfield Creek. The discovery was made by a trapper named Elias Boone. He had been checking his snares in the dawn frost when he noticed a figure curled beneath a clump of birch, barefoot, wrapped in what looked like a torn burlap sheet, skin marbled with purple, fingers swollen and raw. At first he thought she was dead. Then she blinked. Etta Holloway's discovery marked the first undeniable crack in the Holloway facade. She didn't speak, not at first, but her body spoke volumes. The medical examination conducted by Dr. Samuel Ward under candlelight and recorded in brittle ink is preserved in the Tennessee Historical Records vault. I obtained a scanned copy. Patient is female, estimated age 6 years, weight 39 pounds, body covered in lash marks consistent with repeated corporal punishment, left ear infected from torn piercing, significant bruising around the mouth, likely from gagging or force-feeding, fingernails caked with limestone dust, one index finger broken and reset improperly. But it was what they found under her foot that chilled Dr. Ward. Sewn into the sole of the burlap wrap, crudely but intentionally, was a phrase stitched in black thread. She cried during silence. Etta didn't speak for 3 days. During that time, Cordelia Holloway appeared at the clinic once, briefly, before being turned away by the constable. She left behind a small parcel containing a wooden doll with button eyes and a note. Return her when she has been cleansed. The noise is not yet out. Authorities didn't act. Not yet. They viewed it as a domestic matter, harsh, but within the religious rights of a private household. Belle Hive still had no formal child welfare laws. The doctor urged them to report it to Nashville, but was told, if the girl's breathing, it ain't murder, and we don't interfere with the Lord's homes. But for Dr. Ward, it was too much. He began documenting Etta's condition in secret, taking charcoal sketches of her bruises, recording snippets of her sleep talk. Yes, she spoke in her sleep, and what she said was bone-deep disturbing. Don't let the doll see me. He's in the wall again. If I cry too loud, the root comes. It eats the loud ones. Dr. Ward began to suspect that the root referred to some kind of punishment ritual, possibly a symbolic figure used to terrorize the children into silence. He wrote a letter to a colleague in Chattanooga describing what he believed was a case of religious child abuse on a scale he had never encountered. But that letter never arrived. The courier assigned to deliver it never returned to the post. His body was found 6 days later in a dried creek bed, throat slit with surgical precision. His bag was missing, except for one item left beside him, a doll's head, hollow, painted in ash, mouth sewn shut with horsehair. Etta was moved under protective custody to the rear office of the church clinic, hidden from Cordelia, from Elias, from whatever might still be watching. They covered the windows, removed all reflective surfaces, and yet Etta kept staring at the corners of the room, where shadows never quite behaved. On the 4th night, she broke her silence, whispered to Dr. Ward in a voice that barely lifted above breath, "It's louder when I'm away from them." He asked what she meant. The toys. They remember. The authorities still refused to intervene. One injured child wasn't enough to breach the spiritual privacy clause. Reverend Holloway had filed the necessary religious exemption documents years earlier, and despite growing concern, Belle Hive remained loyal to its preacher. It would take one more incident, one act that couldn't be ignored, and it came from Etta herself. On the night of December 17, 1848, Etta escaped her holding room, broke a window latch, ran barefoot into the church's sanctuary. There she stood beneath the pulpit, naked, bleeding, holding one of the forbidden dolls from the Holloway house. No one knew how she got it. She placed it on the altar, then screamed one word, "Watcher!" The lights flickered. The sanctuary doors slammed shut. One deacon swore the walls trembled. Etta collapsed. Her hands were covered in deep cuts, later determined to be self-inflicted with a shard of glass. She had carved something into her own palms. Quiet is not safe. The next day, Dr. Ward went to the sheriff again. He threatened to go to the Nashville papers, to the circuit judge, to the Church of Tennessee's Oversight Board. The sheriff finally relented. Fine, one inspection, one set of eyes, and if it's nothing, it's done. That inspection, conducted under sworn silence and heavy hesitation, was limited to the Holloway's main residence. Cordelia greeted them with polite smiles. Elias quoted scripture about persecution. The children, they were told, were resting in prayer. The sheriff saw no crime, no blood, no bruises, just dolls, lined up on shelves in the parlor, each one named, labeled, dressed in miniature black smocks. One of the dolls was labeled Etta. The sheriff left without further comment, but Dr. Ward did not. He began collecting names, people who had heard things, seen things. He started drawing connections, sketching diagrams, linking missing persons to names scrawled in Holloway church logs. He wasn't a detective, but he was about to become one, because something about Etta's escape wasn't random. She hadn't fallen, she hadn't wandered, she had run from something. It's easy to shut a door. It's harder to admit what might be on the other side. And in Belle Hive, Tennessee, it was always easier to believe in God than in monsters. The first official investigation into the Holloway household began, not with urgency, but with reluctance. Sheriff Alvin Talmadge had served Belle Hive for nearly 3 decades. He was a man of routine, of handshakes and warnings, not arrests, especially not against men of God. When Dr. Samuel Ward insisted something was terribly wrong at the Holloway estate, Talmadge agreed to a single walkthrough. He brought 1 deputy, no warrants, no documentation, no intention of finding trouble. But the moment they stepped past the Holloway gate, both men would later admit off the record that something felt off. The air was still. The wind seemed to die entirely at the threshold. And the closer they came to the house, the more they noticed the smell, not rot exactly, but damp cloth, mold and iron, a cellar scent that had no business on a sunlit porch. Cordelia Holloway greeted them with practiced hospitality. Her hands were stained with something dark, ink, she claimed, though her apron bore what looked very much like dried blood at the hem. Elias was absent. He's at prayer, she said softly. We've been fasting for strength to endure the persecution. Talmadge said little. He glanced around the parlor. Everything was immaculate. No toys, no signs of distress, just quiet, too quiet. No children today? The deputy asked. They're at rest. They sleep during the day. We follow the book of vigilance now. Talmadge raised an eyebrow. Never heard of that scripture. It's old, Cordelia replied. The inspection was brief. They were shown the sitting room, dining area, and the pantry. Everything was in order. Everything. Perfect. Until the deputy noticed a draft, a faint chill brushing his ankle just near the hearth. There was no vent, no visible opening, but when he pressed his palm against the stonework, it hummed, just slightly, like wind against a distant cave mouth. Cordelia saw him feel it, and for the first time her composure cracked. That door is not for men, she whispered. It stays shut unless he calls. Sheriff Talmadge ordered it opened. Cordelia refused. Flatly, firmly. The watcher is listening. If you open the nursery, you let him hear you. Talmadge tried to push past her, but something stopped him. Not physically, psychologically. He would later describe it as a presence, like a weight in the air. Like I'd stepped into a church where every pew was filled with ghosts. They left that day without forcing the issue. Cordelia closed the door behind them, slowly, reverently, as if sealing something in. Dr. Ward was furious. He demanded another inspection, this time with Nashville authorities. But the sheriff refused to escalate. Too little evidence, too much reputation on the line. Ward returned to Etta's bedside. She had stopped eating. Her fingers twitched in her sleep. She mumbled names. Names that did not appear on any public record, but did appear days later in a hidden church logbook Ward uncovered from behind a loose stone in the foundation of the Holloway chapel. He had gone searching for answers and instead found this: the lambs of silence. Abraham, cleansed. Ruth, muted. Liddy, returned. Samuel, sleeps. Etta, escaped, marked for retrieval. Joe, still learning. The words were scrawled in ash across parchment. Several had been struck through with crimson ink. This was no ordinary record. It was doctrine. Ward pleaded with the mayor, the council, the church elders. He presented his medical files, his theory that the Holloways were keeping the children imprisoned, perhaps even torturing them under religious pretext. He was laughed out of the room. Reverend Holloway, they reminded him, had delivered their children, baptized them, married them, buried their dead. You're accusing the most faithful man in Belle Hive of witchcraft, one councilman said. Next you'll say the dolls talk. Dr. Ward didn't laugh. They do, he said. You're just not listening right. Ward returned to Etta. She had taken to drawing symbols on the walls with charcoal, interlocking rings, thorns, tiny figures with no mouths and elongated hands. When he asked what they meant, she only said, "He makes us carve them when we're bad." "Who? Your father?" She shook her head. The root. The final straw came with the death of Deputy Lawrence Wynne. He'd been stationed near the Holloway property for 3 days after the initial visit, observing, listening. The night before his death, he'd sent a note to the sheriff. "I heard scratching from the chimney, thought it was an animal. Then I heard laughter, not the happy kind, more like rehearsed." He was found the next morning in his home, face down, lungs filled with coal dust. No fire had been lit, no soot in the flue, only one clue remained. His eyes had been sewn shut, with doll thread. The sheriff called it suicide, grief madness, he said. Dr. Ward called it what it was, a message. But no one listened, and by then it was already too late, because while the authorities delayed, while they ignored bruises and blood and dolls that whispered at midnight, something else was happening inside the Holloway home. A ritual, a preparation. The root was growing. There are people who brush against the abyss and turn away. And then there are the ones who lean closer, determined to name the shape in the dark. Dr. Samuel Ward was the latter. By January of 1849, Bell Hive had returned to its routine silence. The townspeople kept their eyes low, their questions unspoken. The incident with Etta Holloway was chalked up to a spiritual test. Deputy Wynne's death was mourned, but not questioned, and Elias Holloway preached once again from the pulpit, sermons as smooth as polished stone. But Dr. Ward had seen too much, and he wasn't the only one. There was someone else watching. Her name was Josephine Tanner, a former schoolteacher, recently returned to Bell Hive to care for her ailing mother. She had grown up 3 houses down from the Holloways. Her cousin had once been Cordelia's seamstress, and she remembered the children. They were like shadows, she told me in a letter. They didn't look at you, they looked through you. Josephine had seen the bruises. Heard the screams at night when walking home from choir, but in 1842, after asking too many questions, she'd been dismissed from the schoolhouse for meddling in family affairs. She didn't forget, and when she learned of Etta's escape, she wrote to Dr. Ward anonymously. That letter reached him in February 1849. I was able to examine the original, still archived at the Tennessee Medical Historical Society. The ink is cracked. The edges burned. There were more than 6. They only ever showed 6. But I saw 9 chairs in the nursery once through the side window. There was a 10th one broken. It was always empty. Dr. Ward contacted her immediately. Together they began a private investigation. No warrants, no backup, just a ledger, a lamp, and resolve. Ward started with the church, specifically the baptismal records. Something had never sat right. Elias had claimed to have baptized dozens of Bell Hive's children, but the registry only showed a handful, and the names were off. Samuel Clay, a boy who died at age 3 from consumption. Liddy Rhodes, a girl who vanished in 1845, presumed lost to river current. Abraham Maddox, an orphan, buried with no known relatives. None of them had family connections to the Holloways, but all were listed under Elias's care. As spiritual wards, not adoptions, something else. Sheltered in silence for his purpose, handwritten beside each name. Then came the financials. Josephine, with her background in education, had retained sharp arithmetic skills. She analyzed the church ledgers and found something unnerving. From 1846 to 1848, the Holloways donated over 400 pounds of cured meat, 300 pounds of flour, and enough cloth to clothe 20 children. But they only had, officially, 6. Where was it going? Or who was it feeding? They tracked down local midwives. A handful remembered assisting Cordelia through childbirth, but none had seen a baby afterward. One even recalled being dismissed mid-labor. She screamed like something was being torn out of her, the midwife recalled. Then silence. Then Elias came down the stairs and told me the Lord had taken the child back. He handed me a silver coin and said to forget the noise. In total, Josephine and Dr. Ward identified 11 possible children associated with the Holloways over a 10-year period. Only one had escaped. And the others? Their names weren't in the town ledgers, but they were in a journal. Dr. Ward found it buried beneath a loose board in the church vestry. It had belonged to Reverend Elias Holloway himself. The entries were brief, cryptic, emotionless. Ruth resisted again, cried during prayer, took the voice for 3 days. Samuel looked at the mirror, applied the lash. The watcher stirred. Etta opened the toy box unsupervised. Third warning, preparing the room. Each entry was marked with a symbol, an open eye, a stitched mouth, or a root curling around a crib. Ward began to believe these were not punishments. They were rituals. The toys came next. Josephine discovered that a craftsman named Isaiah Crowley had sold dozens of dolls to Cordelia Holloway between 1845 and 1848. Handmade, many with custom requests, hollow torsos, removable eyes, weighted arms. She asked if he'd ever seen the children play with them. Play, he had said. They never touched them. Cordelia said the dolls weren't for the children. She said they were representatives. Representatives of what? Crowley didn't know. But he remembered the last order he filled, 12 dolls, one larger than the rest, with a hollow chest cavity and spiked joints to prevent unwanted grasping. That doll had been named on the receipt, the Root. By March, Dr. Ward had compiled enough to force the mayor's hand. Journal entries, financial evidence, testimonies, symbols, screams, and Etta, who had begun to speak in full sentences. Her final statement to Dr. Ward, before she went silent forever, was this: "If they make Joe quiet too, the house will close." Close? Like the others? Ward asked what she meant. Etta only stared at the ceiling and whispered, "You won't hear us next time." Josephine made copies of all documents, sent a full packet to the Tennessee state governor, another to a Nashville journalist, and one more to a man named Ezra Klein, a federal investigator, because by now it was clear this was no isolated case. It was a pattern, a system, a theology of silence, and the Holloways were building something beneath that house, something meant to endure. Most houses have blueprints, but the Holloway house had a map, etched in secrecy, papered over with doctrine, and behind every locked door was not just a child, but a step in a ritual none of them chose. In April 1849, the tide finally began to turn. Federal investigator Ezra Klein arrived in Belle Hive with little fanfare. A lean man, stone-voiced, with a face carved by tobacco and sleeplessness. He'd seen war, slavery, rail yard murders, but what he found in that town, tucked in the folds of Tennessee's hills, would haunt even him. His first visit to the Holloway residence lasted exactly 6 minutes. Cordelia did not speak. Elias met him at the door and quoted from Leviticus about the authority of the patriarch and the shields of the sanctuary. He warned Klein that outsiders had no dominion in the watcher's chamber. That phrase caught Klein's attention. And the smell. There was a rot, he wrote, but not from death. It was memory, lingering, like milk, soured in the wall, and something underneath it, like wet cloth that had once been alive. Ezra Klein began interviewing those the local sheriff wouldn't. Laborers, seamstresses, apprentices, children, and what emerged was a pattern not just of cruelty, but systematic concealment. Cordelia had paid seamstresses to create custom clothing for children too fragile for daylight. Many believed she was tending to sickly or invalid children in secret, an act of charity, but none ever saw the children themselves. Clothes and toys were picked up by proxy, by boys who never spoke. A stonemason, hired in 1846 to reinforce the cellar, recalled laying a second wall behind the visible one, a false boundary. He'd assumed it was for insulation, but he was told not to ask questions. "They paid in coin, cold as ice," he said, "and they watched every brick I laid. Not a word, just Elias standing in the corner holding a rope of beads. He said it was a rosary, but it had bones in it." Then came the ledgers. Josephine and Klein, working in tandem, discovered that a dozen children listed as orphans or wards of the state had passed through Belle Hive's church mission between 1841 and 1849. None of them had ever been officially adopted, but every single one had been listed as processed in church logs kept by Elias Holloway. The word used? Cleansed. The dolls were the next clue. Klein discovered a room in the church basement, used only by Elias, that contained dozens of small wooden coffers. Inside each a doll, a swatch of child's clothing, and a parchment bearing a single line, "So they will not speak beneath." These were burial substitutes, not graves, but representations, each with a date, each matching the disappearance of one of the unnamed children. Josephine received an anonymous tip from a young man named Caleb Toms, whose mother had once worked as a cook for the Holloways. He was just 9 when he had gone down to the cellar once, through a servant's stair. He described what he saw to Klein in a written deposition. There were dolls on hooks, all different, all black-clothed. They didn't have eyes, just threads. In the corner was a hole, and inside it was a crib, with something moving, but it didn't cry right. It sounded like it was trying to be quiet. When asked what else he saw, Caleb said, "There was a chair next to it, with belts, and a hymn book open to a page titled, 'Silence is the Mercy of God.'" Klein took the evidence to the Bellhive Town Council. They refused to act. Again, they claimed religious protection, lack of physical proof, fear of desecrating a holy home. That night, Klein returned to the Holloway property with a drawn pistol, a lantern, and 2 volunteers, Josephine and Dr. Ward. They entered not through the front door, but through the old servant's root cellar, long since overgrown. And what they found was the beginning of an architecture. The cellar was deeper than blueprints suggested. There were stairs, rough-cut and narrow, descending into what could only be called a sanctum, walls lined in scripture, scrawled by hand, blood on the floor, scratches along the beams, symbols etched into the ceiling with nails and bone, and along the back wall the nursery, not metaphorical, a real room, 12 cribs, 6 empty, 6 still made, each with restraints, each with a toy at its foot, untouched. In the corner, a crib larger than the others, blackwood, gilded with symbols, lined with leather. It was labeled The Root. Inside, a doll, human-sized, made of straw hair and stitched with animal teeth. Its chest was carved open, empty, a vessel, waiting. Beneath the nursery they found the pit. It was shallow, filled with ash and toys, scorched and charred. Klein later described it as a funeral, repeated, and around the rim, names carved in childlike handwriting: Etta, Liddy, Ruth, Samuel, Joe, and others never spoken aloud. They returned with photographs, sketches, samples, but when they sought a judge's order to raid the full house, the sheriff stopped them. A writ had been filed by Elias Holloway, claiming religious persecution, and one line at the bottom stood out most of all: "The watcher sleeps beneath, but he will wake if the lambs are taken." The town had chosen its silence, but the house had already begun to hum again, because the dolls were not toys. They were placeholders, each one marking a child silenced, each one meant to keep the root from being filled, and they were one doll short. Every monster needs a name, every ritual has a scripture, but what happens when the horror is written not in books, but in lullabies and stitched mouths, when salvation means silence and faith means fear? The Holloways weren't simply cruel. They weren't just zealots or abusers hiding behind faith. They were architects of a belief system, one they built by hand in shadow, brick by brick beneath their house. Ezra Klein and Josephine Tanner found the first true doctrine bound in calfskin and hidden behind the nursery wall. It was not labeled Bible or Psalter, but simply the Book of Stillness. 77 pages, ink and blood. It was written in Elias Holloway's script, though some of the later entries were clearly the work of Cordelia. It read like scripture, but it wasn't. Not Christian, not even recognizable as part of any known sect. It was a theology of silence. Page 1. In the beginning was the cry, and the cry brought the root. The root heard the sound and grew. It fed on disobedience. It fed on screams. Page 12. The watcher is the voice of the root. He listens from the hollow places. When he hears the cry, he opens the mouth that should stay shut. Page 24. Children are born loud, full of sin, full of sound. It is our charge to hush them before the root returns. Each quiet child is a stone in the wall. Each obedient silence is a key in the lock. Page 33. The dolls are memory. They hold the echo of the lambs, so the root does not grow hungry again. This wasn't metaphor. This was law. The Holloways believed, truly believed, that sound awakened something beneath the earth, something ancient and terrible, something they called the root. And worse, they believed children were its favorite food, not flesh, not blood, noise. Cordelia's later writings, found in her private journal, revealed the emotional logic behind the rituals. Joe screamed again today. Elias says we're close to the threshold. If one more voice lifts in disobedience, the root will open. I sang her the silence hymn, but she cried anyway. The doll's mouth burst its stitches that night. We had to burn it. Etta is trying not to speak. I love her for it, but the others stir when she weeps. Even the dolls turn. Cordelia wasn't heartless. She was terrified. She believed what Elias taught her, believed it so fully that she saw each child's voice as a nail in the world's coffin. The ritual patterns became clear. Each child was assigned a doll, a surrogate, a decoy. Each doll was bound, muted, and placed in the nursery chamber when a child cried too loudly or disobeyed. If the crying stopped, no punishment. If it continued, the doll was punished first. Burned, broken, dismembered. If that didn't work, the child followed. One entry dated August 1847 reads, Samuel broke the quiet during thunder. The doll was whipped, but he persisted. We took his voice for 7 days. After that, he was good. The root didn't come. The door didn't open. Praise, stillness. This pattern, sound, substitution, silence, was their religion. Every scream was a summons, every punishment a salvation. They believed the world's safety depended on their household remaining absolutely quiet. And it wasn't just belief, it was inherited. Elias Holloway's father, Hezekiah Holloway, had founded a similar congregation in the Kentucky Hills in the early 1800s, the Church of Tempered Sound. I found its charter archived in a collapsed mining church, now just broken pews and dust. Their central tenet? Only the silent will remain when the root returns. The root, it turns out, was not a metaphor for sin, but for something literal, something buried, something they believed was alive beneath the hills. The Appalachian folklore is rich with stories of things beneath, hungry things, whispers about the buried mouth, the child-taker, and the hush-vine. Elias had taken those fragments and twisted them into liturgy, but the worst was this. They believed the root had already opened once. One passage in the Book of Stillness describes it. It rose when the first child screamed in rage. It swallowed the voice and left the body. The town that heard it no longer exists. Their cries echoed into nothing. We remember them only by silence. There is no record of such a town. But then again, how do you keep track of something you've silenced completely? Klein's notes show he considered the possibility that the Holloways didn't invent their theology, but rediscovered it, that they'd found something, some artifact, some cave beneath the earth, and interpreted it as divine, something that made sound unbearable, something that punished disobedience in physical, measurable ways. There were accounts of children going deaf after spending time in the cellar, of dolls that burst their stitching after a child shouted. One boy reportedly died after humming a tune aloud for too long. His skin blistered, his lungs collapsed. Cordelia called it divine correction. And then there was Joe, the youngest, still alive when the house was investigated, still capable of crying, but bound, always bound. Klein wrote in his journal, I heard her. The sound didn't come from her throat, it came from beneath it, like the sound was being stolen as it formed. Joe was the final child, the last key in their ritual. The doll assigned to her was the largest, the one called the root, and it was still empty, still waiting. Ezra Klein believed they were trying to transfer her voice permanently, to seal the final doll, and through it, close the root forever. They had failed with the others. Etta escaped. Ruth died, Samuel disobeyed. But Joe, she had not yet cried aloud in the presence of another adult. She was the last hope to complete the cycle, to end the watchers listening, to keep the house sealed. And time was running out, because as long as she still breathed, the root could still open. A house holds its breath the moment before a door is broken. It knows it is about to be revealed, and it hates that. April 19th, 1849. Bell Hive woke to the sound of boots and broken silence. Federal investigator Ezra Klein had finally secured a judicial writ for forced entry and child recovery. What changed? A letter, smuggled out of the Holloway house by a still anonymous party, possibly one of the children, possibly Josephine, delivered to the state judge in Knoxville. The letter was just 6 words. There is one child left. Hurry. It was enough. The raid began just after sunrise. 6 men approached the Holloway house from all sides: Klein, Dr. Ward, a state-appointed marshal, and 3 local deputies who had finally turned on Sheriff Talmadge. Josephine stayed behind at the chapel with Etta, who had begun praying aloud the night before, over and over. Don't let them finish the lullaby. Don't let them finish the lullaby. The Holloways did not resist. Cordelia was found in the parlor, dressed in mourning black, cradling a doll that resembled Joe. Its mouth was sewn shut. Its chest cavity was open, empty. Elias was in the kitchen, pouring honey into a cracked bowl. When the marshal ordered him to stand, he simply looked up and said she was almost ready. He was cuffed without incident, but the silence that followed was not peace, it was pressure. The team made their way to the basement. The door was still locked, reinforced iron with rivets sealed in wax. The hinges screamed as they forced it open with a crowbar. The nursery had changed. Gone were the neat rows of cribs. In their place, ash. Doll parts. A twisted altar made of broken wood, thread, and dried flowers. In the center, atop a stone dais, was the root, the final doll, now fully assembled, its chest sealed, its eyes replaced with buttons made of bone, its mouth sewn with sinew, and around its neck a collar, child-sized. Then came the smell, rot and iron, old blood and candle wax. The investigators moved deeper, toward the back chamber. They found Joe there, alive, muzzled, her wrists and ankles bound to a chair. The room had been soundproofed, lined with wools, dolls, and cloth-stuffed crevices, but still she had cried. There were bloodstains on the floor. Her hands were raw, her eyes wide. When the muzzle was removed, she didn't scream. She whispered one word, "Finished?" Ward took her into his arms. Her pulse was faint. She had lost weight, starved to near collapse. Next to her chair was a journal open to the last page of the Book of Stillness. When the 12th doll is filled, the root will rest, and the world will be still. Let the final lamb offer silence. Joe had refused. She had cried, and somehow that had ruined the ritual. The rest of the house was scoured. In the walls, tunnels, child-sized, lined with chalk drawings. In the attic, cages made from church pews, now broken. In the chapel, beneath the altar, a sealed vault. They opened it with crowbars. Inside were remains, small bones, bundles of cloth, dolls decaying next to what had once been children. Each doll had a name stitched across its chest. Some matched the missing children, some didn't. They found 23. Cordelia was questioned first. She said little, only, "We were the last gate. The silence was our task. Now it is yours." Elias was less restrained. He spoke of thresholds, of the buried mouth, and of a prophecy passed from father to son. He claimed his ancestors had once closed the root in the eastern hills, and he had been chosen to finish the work. When asked about the dolls, he said, "They speak when we can't. They remember when we must forget." He was unshaken, even when shown the bones, even when shown Joe. His last words to Klein before being taken were, "If you unmake the silence, be ready to hear what comes." By nightfall, the Holloways were in custody. The house was sealed, but something remained, a sound, not a scream, not a voice, a hum, low, constant, vibrating from beneath the foundation. Klein wrote it off as shifting stone, but Dr. Ward couldn't sleep that night. He returned to the cellar at 3 a.m. He found Joe asleep on a cot, and he found the root, still seated, still stitched, But now, its head tilted, as if listening. The house was condemned the next week, but before it could be demolished, it burned. Spontaneous ignition, no accelerants found. The fire began in the basement. Every doll was destroyed, every journal, every crib, except the root. Its charred remains were recovered, warped and blackened, but intact. It was placed in the Nashville Historical Archive, then removed 2 months later after staff reported murmuring from inside the glass. Its current location is unknown. Jo survived, but she never spoke again, not a word. And in her silence there was something sacred and something utterly terrifying. Justice moves slowly in places where silence is sacred. And in Belhive, Tennessee, the court was just another chapel, its benches worn by the weight of what people refused to say. The trials of Elias and Cordelia Holloway began in August 1849, but trial may be too generous a word. There was no jury, no public gallery. The proceedings were held behind closed doors in the Knox County Courthouse, under pressure from both church officials and state dignitaries. Why? Because the facts were unmanageable. 23 sets of remains. Dozens of dolls linked to children who never officially existed, a basement designed for ritual punishment, and a town complicit in its silence. Too much, too grotesque. The prosecutor wanted murder charges, but most of the remains were too degraded for forensic certainty. The defense claimed religious persecution, cited the First Amendment, called Elias a shepherd misunderstood. The final verdict? Cordelia Holloway, guilty of child neglect and endangerment, sentenced to 20 years hard labor, died within 6 months of incarceration, pneumonia. They say she never spoke again after Jo was taken from the house. Elias Holloway, found mentally unfit to stand trial, committed to the Tennessee State Asylum in Nashville. There, according to orderlies, he recited verses from the Book of Stillness daily, carved symbols into his arms with spoons and cutlery, and in his final days scrawled a final phrase onto the wall with his own blood: "She has made a sound." He died in his cell on March 3, 1850. His mouth had been sewn shut. No one ever found out how. Jo survived. She was taken in by Josephine Tanner, who resigned her teaching post and moved west, raised her in silence, taught her to garden, read, knit. But Jo never made a sound again. Not laughter, not humming, not even crying in sleep. Josephine described her in letters as sweet but untethered. She would line up stones in rows outside, sleep under the bed instead of on it, refuse to look at dolls, ever. She died in 1895, at the age of 52, peacefully but still silent. As for Etta, the first escapee, the voice that cracked the walls, she was institutionalized for several years before being transferred to a convent school near Memphis, took a vow of silence, became Sister Mercy of the Quiet Hand. The convent's journals note she would sit for hours staring at flowers, particularly roses. Once, when a visiting child handed her a music box and wound it, she reportedly fell unconscious. She lived to be 70, died in prayer. Her grave marker reads, "Etta, she broke the cycle." Dr. Samuel Ward never practiced again. After the fire that destroyed the Holloway home, he became a recluse, wrote a single book, The Watcher in the Basement, published privately in 1853. Only 50 copies were printed. Most were lost or burned. The few surviving passages describe his nightmares: dolls speaking in riddles, children reaching through the floor, a mouth beneath the earth whispering in a voice made of all the cries that were never heard. Ward died of heart failure in 1862. A single doll was found near his body. It had no eyes, only ears. Ezra Klein disappeared. Officially, he returned to Washington, but no one heard from him again after 1851. His belongings were sold off. His journal ended abruptly with one final chilling entry: "I heard her. It wasn't Jo. It was something using her voice." The root was gone by then. Some say it was destroyed in the fire. Others say it was taken, or that it left on its own. Belhive never recovered. Not officially, anyway. The Holloway house was erased. The land sold. The remaining townsfolk refused to speak of the events. The church was torn down and rebuilt with no basement. No dolls, no sermons, Children born in the next generation were taught to fear crying. Some were raised without lullabies. A few even refused to name their toys. And late into the 19th century, travelers passing through the hills still reported odd sightings near the old Holloway lot. Children's handprints on the inside of window glass, a low hum that made animals flee, and dolls nailed to trees with their mouths open. Time moves forward, but memory, real memory, lurks like a scent in old wood. You can burn a house, bury the bones, silence the victims, but horror doesn't disappear. It waits, it echoes, and it teaches. Bell Hive, Tennessee still stands today, smaller, quieter. The population has halved since the 1900s, and most visitors pass through without noticing. The town no longer mentions the Holloways. There is no marker, no plaque, not even a mention in the historical museum. But the land remembers. I walked the overgrown lot where the house once stood. The foundation was scorched into the earth, a faint rectangle now tangled in wild grasses. And in the center, where the cellar door used to be, I found a small circle of stones, placed deliberately, 12 of them. When I asked the mayor about it, she shook her head. "We don't tend to that place," she said, "but every few years someone adds a new stone. No one claims to know who does it, but the pattern never changes, always 12, no more, no less." In 1974, a researcher from Vanderbilt University compiled a suppressed report on religious child abuse in early Appalachia. The Holloway Doctrine was only mentioned in the appendix, barely a footnote, but the researcher noted something peculiar. 6 other cases scattered across Kentucky and Tennessee with eerily similar elements: children gagged or silenced for spiritual reasons, dolls used as behavioral tools, basements converted into nurseries with binding implements, references to the Watcher, the Root, and the Book of Stillness. None of those cases were prosecuted. The families relocated. The evidence vanished. In 2006, a storm unearthed several bones near Crowsfield Creek. The state classified them as animal remains, but an independent anthropologist, now deceased, said otherwise in a leaked report. Small bones, juvenile, several with unnatural breaks, some fused prematurely, suggestive of extended confinement or binding. No further excavations were permitted. And then there are the stories. People claim to see dolls in the trees during fog, to hear whispers near the soil in the early hours before dawn. Parents who hike near Bell Hive report sudden stillness in their children, infants going rigid, wide-eyed, silent for hours. One woman claimed her daughter, age 4, began drawing symbols on her bedroom wall after a weekend trip to the area, symbols that matched the carvings found in the Holloway basement. She was never told the story. Not all legacies are remembered in monuments. Some are remembered in absence, in the lullaby that never returns, in the child who suddenly stops humming, in the old doll left in a box with the mouth stitched too tightly to smile. But not every story ends in shadow. Joe's grave is located outside of Boone's Crossing, marked only with a stone angel and a single word, "survived." Next to it, Josephine Tanner's stone reads, "She listened when no one else would." Every spring, anonymous visitors leave bundles of yarn at the grave, uncut, untangled, a tribute to the voices that were once taken. And in 2020, a group of trauma therapists and historians established the Stillness Foundation, a non-profit dedicated to the psychological study of ritual-based child abuse and its historical concealment. Their motto is taken from Joe's final whisper, "Finished." But beneath that, in fine print, is the one phrase that keeps this story alive: "We heard you."